Nations Environment Program, and we'd like to welcome you to this third of the webinar series on Sustainable Living 1.5, Empowering People to Live Better and Lighter. Today's webinar is on keeping fashion close to home for better and lighter living. And this webinar series is being brought to you by Eco City Builders and the UN Environment Program and the One Planet Works Sustainable Lifestyles Education Program. So without further ado, I would like to hand over the floor to Ms. Garrett Clark, the Program Officer for Sustainable Lifestyles at UNEP. On to you.
Thank you so much, Andre, and welcome everyone, and welcome to our presenters as well. I'm Garrett Clark. I'm the Sustainable Lifestyles and Education Program Officer at the United Nations Environment Program. And Andre mentioned that today is the third webinar we have on keeping fashion close to home for better and lighter living. It's one in a series that UNEP is hosting on Sustainable Living 1.5. And the reality is about people and sustainability is that most people, when they wake up in the morning, they don't think about saving energy, buying sustainably. They think more about getting something to eat, what they're going to have to do that day, getting dressed, getting on to their lives. And that is what those are the domains around living that people think about. The work that has been done in sustainability tends to use a language looking at either the resource flows, energy flows, or the impacts, whether it's climate or biodiversity, or looking at methodologies and approaches such as circularity or life cycle assessment. In a way, some of these terms are not as easily accessible to most people. But when you look at a people-centric approach and apply a people lens to how we live, we have a huge opportunity to activate people towards sustainability. And that's the purpose behind this webinar series, because we know the evidence behind how people procure and make decisions in their lives. They do it around how they move, the food they eat, the stuff that they procure or buy or long to acquire, the things that they do to entertain themselves, and how they look at their finances. So when you apply that lens towards sustainability, we have a chance to unleash a great amount of power. So tonight's webinar is looking at fiber, textiles, fashion, as it's one of the key areas that people have a very strong relationship with, an emotional relationship with. So what I'm going to do in the next moment or two is outline some of the other elements we have in the webinar series to entice you to come back, and then hand it over to Kirsten Miller from Eco City Builders, who's going to take us through. So could I see the next slide, please? So when you look at the way in which people think about sustainable living, you see in the media, through our friends, through our local communities, an increasing number of ways that we can live more sustainably. But what is the evidence behind that? What are the issues around how we live sustainably? Part of the webinar series looks into how people make decisions around sustainability and how better we can tap into that decision-making process. Because people in general tend to make decisions around cost, availability, and other factors which can include sustainability, but especially now with COVID, the issue of wellness and overall quality of life are increasingly important. The second group of webinars that we have dive more deeply into the things that we do on a daily basis, those decisions. We look at mobility, tourism, food, and then tonight we're looking specifically, as I mentioned, at looking at how to keep fashion closer to home. But we're doing another webinar in October that's looking at Don't Touch My Stuff, consumer products, fashion, and plastics, because the issue around fashion and textiles covers a breadth of different kinds of areas that need to be better understood in order to activate change. And finally, the final set of webinars that we have are around things that are already happening and how we can upscale those, and what are some of the tools and resources that we can use. Could I see the next slide, please? So as a final comment, before turning it over, before giving a brief overview of the agenda, let me ask if you'd be interested, and please do come to our next webinar, which is about dispelling myths on sustainability. If it's the right thing to do, why isn't it happening? This is looking at how we communicate around sustainability and whether in fact we actually need to use the word sustainability or the jargon that goes with it in order to promote and activate people for change. And so with that, the final slide is I'd like to give you a brief overview of how we're going to be spending the next hour and a half together. Could I see the next slide, please? So the agenda for tonight, there we go. The agenda for tonight is Kirsten Miller is going to take us through the introduction to the speakers, and then we have one of our speakers who will be taking us through the moderation. And the way in which the agenda is set is that the first presentation is more about the context around sustainable fashion and textiles. What is the global impact that are there for sustainability as well as for social engagement, and where our speakers today fit into that. And then we have three presenters who are going to be talking about concrete actions that are already happening at local level that could be incredibly motivating in order to activate change. And with that very brief introduction, I'd like to hand it over to Kirsten to introduce us to our speakers tonight.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Garrett, very much. Thank you to the panelists. I am very excited about this particular webinar, and I wanted to just briefly thank UNEP and One Planet for supporting it. I'm Kirsten Miller, Executive Director of EcoCity Builders, and this webinar is going to be focusing, as Garrett mentioned, on textiles and fiber systems. And we'll get an overview of the whole landscape of sustainable fiber and fashion. But in this particular webinar, and why I'm so excited is we're really focusing on some of the emerging initiatives in the United States, in the Americas. And we're going to start with an overview from Dr. Katya Vladimirova. She is with the Sustainable Fashion Consumption Working Group, so sort of an overall landscape of the context of our topic. Next, we'll hear from Winona Leduc, who I think many of you already know very well, a very well-known environmentalist and activist in the United States, who is now diving into sustainable fiber and fiber systems, especially with hemp fiber. And she is also with Honor the Earth and the Anishinaabe Agricultural Institute, group of different indigenous peoples that are primarily in the Great Lakes region of the United States and Canada. Next, we'll have more of a drill down on the Northern California Fibershed initiatives and hear what's happening there from Rebecca Burgess, who is the director of Fibershed, and we're teaming up with them lately to look into what's going on with these fiber systems and the producers, and where, if possible, can we start to bring back fiber system processing. So hopefully soon we can start making more of our own clothing and textiles in the United States like we used to. And then to sort of like show us the way towards this reintegration of the systems, we have Harry Moser with the Reshoring initiative. So he's going to look at how we can bring back these manufacturing systems to the United States. But the main thrust of that is how do we do that in a sustainable way that actually builds soil and sustainability instead of subtracting that from the earth. So without further ado then, I want to hand over the mic to Dr. Katya Vladimirova for our overview. So Katya, could you please give us about 10 minutes of your presentation? Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Kirsten and Garrett. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. I'm Katya Vladimirova. I am a senior research associate at the Institute for Sociological Research at the University of Geneva. So I'm based in Europe, but I am very curious about the context in the United States because it's one of the major, obviously, markets for what's been driving unsustainable practices in fashion, which is fast fashion. So could I have my first slide, please? So I was tasked with a Herculean task, really, to cover in 10 minutes the context for sustainable fashion, what that is, and how local community solutions fit in. So I will do my best, and of course, it's going to be a very limited account. There's a lot that people want to talk about when the word fashion comes in. Could I have the next slide, please? What I did, I used some key facts that are more or less solid, because there's a lot of misinformation in the world of fashion, unfortunately. And as an academic, I have to sift through a lot of fake facts or fake information that circulates on the web. Well, these are the more reliable sources that I have found in the past couple of years. So since fashion and sustainability as a problem, they have come up to the attention of the public and of those people who actually have to do something about it from the industry. So we know that today, due to the rise of fast fashion, fashion and textiles have become the fourth most polluting domain, in the sense it's a CO2 intensive domain upstream in Europe. We have this data only for Europe, but it's easy to project to get an idea that indeed what we consume in terms of fashion, the rapid changes of collections of clothes and apparel in general, which includes shoes and accessories and sportswear and different kinds of apparel that exists. So this data we have, and as Garrett was saying, among the different domains of lifestyles, this is the fourth most polluting after food, mobility, and housing, the way we use energy in our homes. So it's a very important domain that needs our attention to adjust it to sustainability rails. Unfortunately, since recently, fashion industry has been breaching so-called planetary boundaries. There's a number of those boundaries in terms of environmental impact, and fashion has been trespassing the safety boundaries that exist in terms of producing CO2 emissions, of course, on the production cycle, transportation, disrupting nitrogen cycles, and using fresh water for growing crops such as cotton that are required to produce fabrics. So fashion is really badly pushing the environmental boundaries that exist today, to cut it short. And of course, that on the environmental side of sustainability, on the social side of sustainability, we see elements of modern slavery in the really complex supply chains that fashion industry has developed. About that, you probably heard through different communication channels of advocacy groups, perhaps Fashion Revolution, perhaps other channels, but this is something that's talked about. Who makes our clothes, where it is made, at which conditions. So I think what Harry is going to talk about is really going to fit really nicely into addressing this problem. And finally, just to give you an idea, production of fashion has doubled in the past 20 years, and the key markets leading the growth of fast fashion today are not the global north, are not the Europe or North America anymore. These are emerging economies such as China, India, Brazil, Russia, Mexico, with the growing middle class and the growing, certain lifestyle aspirations. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So another fantastic report, also very recent, only less than a year old, tells us that 80% of carbon footprint of clothes occurs at the production phase, and only 20% is the contribution of consumers. And in terms of actions that the industry, on the production side, that we need to take in order to improve sustainability, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation report, a reputable report, outlined the following 5 actions, and I would like to address each action now and see more or less how we could fit local solutions, some of which we're going to discuss today, into this broader plan of action for the global fashion industry. So the first thing to do is that's important to do is to phase out substances of concern and microfibers For example, solutions that support local natural dyeing practices or local less chemical intensive production practices is a kind of local solution that could support this action. Effectively use resources and move to renewable inputs. In terms of textile production, we're talking about the market being dominated by polyester today, and we know the polyester is produced from oil, which is not a renewable resource. So we need to find solutions at local, regional, and global levels that could help really phase out those non-renewable resources and try to have some solutions that are more sustainable in the long run. So I think what we want to talk about later today and about hemp is another solution that could fit into this action area. The third one is to radically improve recycling, and here a wide, broad range of topics comes up from zero waste design. So when designers conceptualize their clothes, their accessories, to really think in terms of producing something without extra waste during the production phase. Of course, new fiber recycling techniques, they are emerging. There is many different things that people are trying. Innovations are happening in this area, and this is an important avenue for optimizing performance of the fashion industry. The fourth one, and the most straightforward one really, is shortening supply chain and focusing on local production and consumption. And finally, increasing utilization of clothes that already exists. And since I come from the background of sustainable fashion consumption, and I am the founder of the working group on sustainable fashion consumption among academics and practitioners, give me just 1-2 more minutes to cover this part, the last part. How can we increase utilization of clothes that already exist? Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So I just wanted to briefly, towards the end, cover the main trends in consumption that are signaling that there is indeed interest in sustainability among consumers, right? And I'm speaking here, mostly these are trends in the global north, so keep that in mind. It's not everywhere that these kind of things are popular. In terms of extending the lifespan of garments, we know also from the same report of Mistra Fashion Foundation from Sweden that using a t-shirt twice as long halves its carbon footprint. This is fantastic news. Basically, if we use the same garments twice as long, we're going to really reduce our carbon footprint in terms of clothes that we use. How can we continue using things longer? There are several different categories of actions that we can take and that people are taking. Secondhand, buying secondhand clothes. Secondhand market is projected to exceed fast fashion market in 2028. So in less than 10 years, we see emergence of wide range of platforms online, but also offline, in which people can purchase secondhand garments. Now we have peer-to-peer networks such as Poshmark in the United States, Vestiaire Collective, or Vinted in Europe. They are mushrooming, and now the strongest are surviving. So they're mature. It's a maturing market of different exchange platforms in terms of monetary exchange of secondhand garments. We also see a growth of rental and swapping. Rental is a more business-oriented practice, obviously, and some even fast fashion retailers are engaging into rental practices. In the US, it would be, I think it was Banana Republic that recently launched a line. But in terms of swapping, this is a more altruistic exchange in which you have a non-monetary give-take kind of exchange of clothes and apparel. And we even have some global bodies, such as a Global Fashion Exchange organization that has developed detailed guidelines of how can we exchange clothes. Finally, the growing numbers of repair cafes, which is a provides functional and creative space for people to engage with their clothes, to upcycle their clothes, to fix their clothes, to fall in love with their clothes again. Unfortunately, and I will finish with this slightly, we say a great grain of salt in this sugary pot, in Russia we say this, we see from research that unfortunately it's not the altruistic concerns, it's not concerns of sustainability or environment that drive people most to engage with collaborative fashion consumption, the practices that I have just listed. It is money. And this research comes from a fantastic group in the US. It's led by Cosette Armstrong at the Oklahoma University. So the study found that money is still the biggest driver to engage people into collaborative fashion consumption. Community and trust matters, of course, in all of these exchanges. And especially when it comes to local initiatives. So this is just an insight that could help guide further interactions and maybe efforts to optimize and increase sustainability of fashion consumption and production on both sides. I thank you for your attention, and I will join a bit later for moderating the questions and answers.
Thank you, Katya. Thank you for keeping to the time limit too. It was a lot to cover in 10 minutes, and I appreciate how you were able to consolidate, give us a lot of great information. And I hope people, just to note, we're saving all of the questions to the end. So please send your questions over as they come up, and we're going to be curating that at the end of our session. So I'm going to just keep moving on, and I'd like Winona to please give your presentation next. We're going from the global overview, and we're going to land right into the US area of the Great Lakes region and learn about what Winona's doing with fiber and hemp.
Thank you. Ani Nindoe Magadaja Kaloma relatives. Happy to be here visiting with you. I'm from the White Earth Reservation in northern Minnesota. For those of you who don't have a lot of indigenous geography, Anishinaabe people, northern part of 5 American states, southern part of 4 Canadian provinces. And I'm a farmer that raises particularly traditional varieties of our vegetables in our region, a lot of which are the good things for climate change and are local, but also I'm a hemp farmer. And I've been growing for 5 years with a state of Minnesota permit. Can I show my slides up? So this is just some art from our area. I'm a water protector, and this is some of the water protector art. We've been, a long time. Half of our land is water, and so we protect a lot of it. Next picture, please. And this is just a little bit of introduction about who we are. This is art from our territory. I know you guys don't have any knowledge of our community, but this is kind of shows the relationship of people, and we are all in the same canoe. That's the name of this art, which I really think is this moment in time. Is, no matter who you are, pandemic is portal. That's what Arundhati Roy refers to this as. It's this moment when we can change things. So let me tell you a little bit about our farming. Next slide. This is our hemp farm, and I started fiber hemp production growing about 5 years ago, mostly because I refer to hemp as the new green revolution. And I think that's what we need, because the last green revolution didn't work out for a lot of people, including a lot of indigenous people. And now what I see is that hemp has this potential, perhaps more than any crop, to change and transform a materials economy, whether it is from textiles, which is what I'm primarily interested in, to materials economy. Anything that you made out of plastic, you no longer need to make out of plastic. As a matter of fact, you could make it out of hemp, but maybe we just shouldn't make some of that stuff. The bigger question. And then as far as food and oil. And so this is my farm. This is where I'm broadcasting from as it is now. And so let's go to the next picture. So in this process, this is some of the people. This is Alex Whiteplume, tried to grow hemp for many years, arrested. This is the Pine Ridge hemp crop. And so a little bit of geography. In my neck of the woods, we have landed tribes with millions of acres of land. A lot of land justice issues similar to other communities on a worldwide scale. And in these communities, we have this potential to grow this crop. That's because hemp is a very versatile crop, and the areas that it originated from are similar to the areas, and it grows in today are similar to the areas that we have here. So this is the Pine Ridge Reservation. Our intention is to build an intertribal hemp cooperative that will grow fiber hemp, materials economy hemp, and food hemp for our region. But millions of acres of potential in our territory, and we see hemp as part of the catalyst for that change. Alex White Plume, one of the fathers, we call him the Hemperor. Next one. And this is Trudel. Oh, you got the longer slide. So this is Trudel, another of the fathers of the hemp industry. So next picture. This is a little bit about the hemp parts, and 80% of the crop is actually hurd, which is what you make hempcrete out of. Also can transform the building industry into a low carbon. Hemp is in fact a carbon sink. But what I'm after is the bast fiber, and that's what you use for textiles. Next picture. This is us growing, it looks like bamboo, you know, in our communities. This is some of my family and our crop a couple of years ago. Next picture. This is our crop last year. Next picture. This is a CBD hemp crop. Next picture. This is old equipment. Now, the problem that we face is, if anybody ever saw the film Who Killed the Electric Car, it's the same problem with hemp. When hemp was criminalized in North America, all of the technology disappeared with it. And so you can't even figure it out. I'm trying to figure out what's going on in Romania, the Czech Republic, China, other industries, you know, Belgium, where they are still continuing processing hemp. But this is some of the old equipment, and there is nothing left in this country. So I started trying to find a decorticator a couple of years ago, which was like looking for a unicorn, and looked up a lot of equipment, tracked down all this stuff, and I ended up with the decorticator from China. Next picture. I don't know if this is this is the Chinese decorticator, because it turns out that what we discovered during COVID and beyond is that everything is made in China. And as my colleague Harry Mosier is going to talk about, we need to reindustrialize this country so you make stuff that makes sense, like equipment that we need. Next picture. One of my cousins processing hemp fiber with the Chinese decorticator. Next picture. This is some high quality hemp fiber grown by one of our neighbors. Next picture. This is hemp fiber processed in a Japanese artisan hemp method. We're looking at all the different methodologies, knowing that some of it will be for fine fiber, some of it will be for rope. This is hemp rope. Obviously the stuff used for sales, and there's our wigwam, and there's us processing again. Next picture. Building materials, again, many options in that. Next picture. You know, it's really the answer. That's why I call it the new green revolution. This is some old time harvesting. You know, this new modern harvesting is what we're also looking at. Next picture. And the reasons that you want to grow from hemp, this is a picture of Henry Ford, is a lot of what Katya talked about. So cotton, which represents most of our global clothing supply, you know, if it's not made of fossil fuels, which we should just move beyond in any realm, 2.4% of the cropland, 24% of the world's chemicals, all on irrigated cropland. Hemp has 3 times the tensile strength of cotton, doesn't need irrigation, and doesn't need any chemicals. And once you figure out how to process it, you can make everything from canvas. The word canvas comes from cannabis. The word canvas comes from cannabis. So huge potential, you know, for across the line. Next picture. So these are the hemp mills in Minnesota. We used to have 11 hemp mills in Minnesota. All disappeared around 1940. And so basically, I just want to rebuild the hemp mills in Minnesota. That'd be great. Because this is not something that you're going to do on a small scale individually. This is a rope making machine is the next one. Also from China. Next picture. Everything's made in China. Next picture. The Chinese team that put together all this for us. And then there's us at Winona's Hemp. So our goal is to transform a hemp economy, rebuild a hemp economy in North America, and make sure that Native people who are in the middle of our, you know, our constant work for land justice and economic justice are at the table and not on the menu. And so we're looking at technology and hoping to partner with people on a worldwide scale to rebuild a hemp industry, because it makes a lot of sense for textiles. So thanks again for your time and letting me present.
Thank you, Winona. That is just so exciting. I can't wait to see what emerges with this new industrial hemp. I think there's so much potential in the United States with the tribes, with the land that's available. Also, I did learn that the most recent farm bill that passed has some new opportunities for industrial hemp that were, before prohibited. So now's the time, and I really hope that within this, community and people who are joining this call, we can, keep this rising up. So thank you very much.
Miigwech, thank you.
But I'd like to just keep moving because we're really keeping to our time, and we'll have time for questions at the end, which will be really good. So I'd like to introduce Rebecca Burgess with FiberShed in Northern California, and she's going to be talking about this regional FiberShed and some of the activities that are happening here with various types of fibers and processes. So Rebecca, could you please go ahead?
Thank you. Thank you, Kirsten. Thank you, Winona, Katya, Garrett, and Harry. This is an honor to be here. And Winona, I am so in love with what I am seeing. And we gotta support more. That's all I come up with this feeling of we gotta manifest exactly what you're talking about. Get the capital resources flowing. So I will start with my first slide, and I'll introduce myself through this presentation. So again, Rebecca Burgess, the executive director of an organization called FiberShed, which is focused on place-based fiber systems, looking at fiber through the lens of how we would look at a watershed or a food shed. It's just a term that helps us understand a strategic geography that can define a textile resource base. And it allows us to get more connected, irreverent, appreciative, and in reciprocity with our place. Because my ancestors are definitely part of the colonizer community that came to California and through the West. There's a lot of repair and reparation work that needs to be done. And one of the personal practices that I have is giving back as much as I can to ecosystem function of the place I live, learning the native plants, being in communication with myself as part of an ecosystem, not in domination of an ecosystem, really unpacking my own ancestral baggage while coming into relationship with place is a lot of what you see imbued in the work that is where I'm at in my own life. You see it reflected in our organizational work. Next slide. This community of people you see represented in very small writing on the map on the left are the people who came together in what is known as typically the San Francisco Bay Area and the surrounding rural communities came together to produce a wardrobe. They were spinners, weavers, felters, farmers. A lot of women came together and built a wardrobe, and I wore it for 1 year to explore the idea of what bioregional textile production felt like on my body, to understand what place-based textile systems could look like and what it looked like at the prototype scale. I personally live in Coast Miwok territory that borders Kashaya-Pomo territory, just north of what is known as San Francisco. And this is the community that I brought together. They didn't know each other before, and they all came together to work on this prototype wardrobe. So it's turned into an organization that works to promote natural fiber systems. We continue to build relationships between farmers and makers, and our work includes public education about natural fiber systems and place-based fiber systems. And we are facilitating and fostering the regional investments in our neck of the woods to help better for us to be able to better metabolize the fiber we grow. There's a lot of waste and a lot of not paying attention to what's already being grown and how to metabolize that for our own bodies. And I'm sure Harry will have a lot to say about why we can't take our own raw materials and make our own things right now. That's a lot of what we're work is to overcome. Next slide. So the reason why we also do this, which Katya brought up, we have primarily access to synthetic fibers, and they're fossil carbon based. That's acrylic, calpolene, polypropylene, nylon. That's like around 60 to 70% of what you have access to. So a lot of what we're doing is establishing fiber sovereignty in our communities. What do you have access to? Can you even wear local fiber? You should be able to. You should have the freedom and access to do so, but we aren't able to do that in many cases because we're flooded with fast fashion textiles that are heavily reliant on fossil carbon. Next slide. And we saw that really fast fashion, as defined by the major brands who have all these issuances of new textiles 12 times a year, that kind of rapidity of consumption that the business model depends upon also depends on fossil carbon. So the rise of polyester tracks really well with the opening of H&M. We just see the skyrocketing use of a fossil carbon substance to perpetuate these cheap blends. It's not just a cotton t-shirt anymore, it's a polyester cotton t-shirt, or your pants have polyester and everything. And the reason they do that is because the war economy subsidizes cheap oil, and cheap oil infuses all of your textiles. So your textiles are very connected to a military industrial complex and the subsidization of fossil fuel distribution. A lot of the things that the water protectors are pushing back against are actually perpetuated with our purchasing of polyester, nylon, and such. So these things are all very intertwined here. Next slide. The model we've supported and continue to refine is based on a soil-to-soil framework for textiles in our home community, and any community can follow this. You grow it, you do all you can to metabolize it within your community, and you have the manufacturing near the production, so you shorten the distances between production and consumption, you regionalize that, and then at the end of many mending attempts and clothing swaps and every way you can keep clothing in play, right? You want it to be a heritage garment. You want it to last many generations. But let's say it does get to, the moths get it, or it falls apart. You should be able to compost it, and it needs to become microbe food to feed the next generation of soil community members that are going to raise up that hemp or whatever, feed those sheep. So we really see the circular economy defined by soil to soil, which is, I know, a little bit interesting for folks who think circular economics is just a mechanical cycle. It's actually a bigger biogeochemical cycle that we're invested in. Next slide. So here's just a human face to those collaborations. This is a woman on 10 acres raising a conservation livestock breed called a Jacob sheep. And I point to this because it's a photo of a woman who rode her bike for 2 days to get to the farm, worked with hand spun yarn and knitted into this sweater shirt that I still wear. And just the fact that you can make clothing just with 2 sticks and sheep's wool that comes off the back of these sheep, and you don't need to dye it. This whole idea of dye is so perpetuated by this addiction that we've had to bleaching fiber and growing only white cotton and only white wool. But there's no reason that whiteness needs to be the case. There's so much color in what nature produces, and this shirt is a great example of that. And only in place-based systems does that beauty get to evolve, because the major monolithic systems that wash our wool overseas, they'll only really wash white wool. So we rarely see the color of nature reflected in our clothes because the manufacturing systems don't support it. Next slide. Here's an example of how we're just bringing people together. It looks like a Brady Bunch screen on our website, and we have small manufacturers, retailers, farmers, designers and makers of all kinds, all political stripes. Like Winona said, we're all in the canoe together. So we organize our canoe around place and working together to make reality happen together. And so this is a producer program page on our website, and all these people collaborate and network to create textile together at the community scale. Next slide. And what we realized in our home community was we were producing now, I think, close to 4 million pounds of wool every year. California is the largest producer of wool in the country of the United States. We produce close to 1 million pounds of wool that competes with the quality of Australia and New Zealand, but we have no way of wearing that wool unless you have 2 knitting needles and you are really talented turning wool from the point of shearing the sheep to your skin. If you have the skills to do it, we do have some emerging mills, and I'll talk about our economic development work in a moment. But when I made this map with our colleagues, we mapped all the flocks in California, and the large flocks are noted by the large circles. That's 1,000 sheep per large circle, and the darker the circle, The higher the quality of the wool for your skin, the lighter the circle, the more you would use that for insulation and bedding and other durable goods. So we've already roadmapped our state and what we can do with wool because we know the quality and quantity of what we have. And about 2/3 of this we don't even see used at all right now. It's just doesn't get sold, sits in distribution centers, goes into ditches, gets stored in the barn rafters. So we'll go to the next slide. You know, Winona brought up some really key things about irrigated landscapes and cotton systems, but currently California is by far the largest producer of Pima cotton, which is the long staple cotton that has a very high quality. What's interesting, we produce 439 million pounds per year. 80% of it is the extra long staple. And that means we're growing enough in our state, our desert-like growing conditions, to secure everyone in the United States with 1.3 pounds of pure cotton per year, just in our state alone. So it's a really interesting metric that is just part of our regional landscape at this moment. Next slide. Here's how sheep fit into an ecological system. We talk about the challenges with cotton, and certainly there are also probably some solutions in cotton systems that could be explored. Hemp being one of those solutions, just make some transitions in cropping systems. But sheep are used now in California to graze under solar panels. There's carbon sequestration research going on about when you graze sheep under solar panels, how you're cycling carbon healthfully in those systems. They also graze really well under the wind turbines. This is a 6th generation ranch about 15 minutes from where I live, and this wool is used in a lot of the textile work that we do. Next slide. Sheep are also used in what we call integrated crop livestock systems. This idea that wool or any protein fiber has to be created on virgin lands, and overgrazing of landscapes has been a huge issue. It's actually how the West in many cases was colonized, is through livestock. So how do you repair relationships? Well, one of the things is we're using a ton of Roundup to spray in California wine grapes. We have 800,000 acres of wine grapes, most of it managed with synthetic chemistry that is neurotoxic and carcinogenic. So another way to stack functions on 1 acre that's already in perennial agriculture, like row crop grapes, is to actually manage with sheep. We've seen increases in microbial biomass, carbon sequestration, water holding capacity, and we're producing, people are drinking wine. So we've got wine, we've got wool, we've got lamb, all coming off 1 acre. Instead of disaggregating those parts and consuming intact ecosystems to achieve those material cultural results. Next slide.
Rebecca, there's about 1 minute left. I'm sorry, just to let you know though.
Okay. So we'll keep going through a couple more slides. If you could go, I won't go through the life cycle of the garment. I'll wrap it up. Next slide. Next slide. And I'll just show what we're focused on right now is to actually, in a life cycle assessment capacity, figure out the places where we can draw atmospheric carbon down into our farming systems, into the soil, rebuild our soils, and actually roadmap climate beneficial textiles at the community scale. And we'll do, I think, the last slide. Next slide. This one's great. So this is how we've started to work with we worked with a biogeochemist who's now at the Union of Concerned Scientists to focus on what it means to compare a wool garment that we've imported from the transnational supply chains and compare it to a garment that we would make in our home that includes the soil restoration capacity of the land where the sheep are grazed by enhancing carbon stocks in those soils, using renewable geothermal, solar, and wind to actually manufacture the garment. And then we take into account the care of the garment, so how you wash it, washing in cold. And also we took into account the labor, so people working at the mill and getting to live, bicycle to work instead of commute hours. So if we regionalize and tighten up this supply chain, at the far right of this bar graph in the green section, you can see that's a garment that we could actually produce in our home community that actually sequesters or is responsible for sequestering up to about 75 pounds of carbon or 37.3 kilograms of carbon. All the other examples are tweaks in the industrial system as it exists, but to point to this vision of clothing that actually impacts the climate positively while creating rural livelihoods and new opportunities to create and make beauty in your home community. So that's what we're working on, and we've capitalized a few mills to do this, and the work continues to really rebuild these regional infrastructural components that will allow us to manifest this for everyone in our community. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Rebecca. There's so much deep knowledge, information, and experience through Rebecca's organization and all the producers that she works with. So I really hope that you check out the Fibershed website, sign up for their newsletters. And Rebecca has also, she didn't mention it, but she just recently published a book. So please also check that out. So I would like to now introduce Harry Moser, our final speaker on reshoring strategies for textiles. And following Harry's presentation, then we'll start the Q&A part of our webinar. So Harry, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Kirsten. If I had listened to Rebecca beforehand, I would not have worn my red dyed shirt. I'd read something more natural looking, but I learned with experience, I guess. The next slide. Okay, so I'm going to talk about reshoring. And for those of you who don't know, when something that's going to be consumed in our market is produced offshore, we call that offshoring. And when it's once again produced here, we call that reshoring. Some people would call that localization. It's also what one of you, maybe Rebecca, referred to as the shorter supply chain. Because of the shorter supply chain, you cut environmental impact and all the other considerations that were mentioned. So I'm not a textile or apparel expert. So my job is to show you that much reshoring is feasible, and that we can do that and eliminate some of the environmental concerns, that the decision to buy based on price, which is what most companies do, most people do, is not necessarily the best decision, and that if we get away from that, then much of what everyone here is espousing can be achieved. So next slide. So to emphasize that point, that price, that money drives everything, just like Katia mentioned that the reuse of the garments is largely driven by money. The buying and the original production is driven by money. So we along with Plant Moran, a big consulting company, surveyed manufacturers and said, why do you offshore? And overwhelmingly, they said price. We go there because it's cheaper. And why do we go there because it's cheaper? Because our customers want the cheapest thing that we can give them within some vague acceptable quality range. But if you're going to achieve what you want to achieve, you have to find a way to do it at a price that's going to be acceptable to your customer. Because if it isn't, it's not going to happen. The brand, the manufacturer, the retailer will insist on going to the cheapest thing they can find, and your solution will not be chosen. That's just, it's not just true for apparel and textile. It's true for throughout the industrial range of products. Next. So the things that my nonprofit offers that help to make this happen, the TCO estimator, I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. That's total cost of ownership. And then we have programs that we're working with states to implement. Specifically, SBS is siting, which is where do you build your factory, and buying smarter. So we provide tools to help convince the OEMs that they can justify reshoring. We have import substitution program, which helps suppliers, and most of you would be suppliers, help suppliers convince the OEMs to buy from you instead of importing. And we have supply chain gaps where we identify national gaps like gloves and masks and penicillin, all these things that we've seen are not produced here, and then we help and motivate people to fill those gaps. And we offer this service through companies, through economic developers, through other groups across the country. Next. You skip one. Go back one. Okay. So this total cost of ownership, which I mentioned, it's online on our website, reshorenow.org, and you go in, it's free, you sign up, you sign in, and you answer 29 questions about the US source and the foreign source. And in this case, the Chinese price was $70, the US price was $100. Easy decision by the buyer, 30% difference, get it out of China. Huh? That's how they get rewarded, that's how they get promoted. But when they did total cost of ownership, it turned out to be 98 for China, 108 for the US. So now only a 10% difference instead of a 30% difference. And assuming that Chinese wages continued to go up as they had been, within 2 or 3 years, the Chinese total cost would be higher. So hopefully that purchasing person, that company, would say it's not worth sending the new thing off, and let's start planning to bring the things that are already there back and either expand our factory or find companies like yours to make the products for us. Next. So to show you the power of using this, I took the first 180 cases that we had where users had gone in and compared the Chinese price to the US price for the exact same product, from their perspective, the exact same product. And the blue curve is a histogram, so a distribution, sort of normal distribution, that shows the ratio of the Chinese price to the US price. And you can see that the peak of it, which would be called the mode, is around 70%, 72%. But for the exact same products, looking at total cost instead of price, the peak is more like 85%. And if there happens to be a 15% Trump tariff in effect on the product, then the peak is around 98%. Okay? And so what counts is what percentage of the area under the curve is to the right of 100%, because 100% is where the Chinese and the US price or TCO are equal. To the right of that, the US had the advantage. So when you go from price 8% of the time, the US wins, to TCO 32%, and with a Trump 15% tariff, 46%. So just by getting the companies to measure correctly, we get a dramatic increase in the feasibility that any of the products that you're proposing will be economic, and only if they're economic will the companies choose to do it. I mean, will the big volume companies? You can sell a little bit here, make a sweater, do it, sell 100, do it. But if you want to make a big impact on employment, on the environment, on all these things we'd like to make, you've got to convince a combination of the companies and the buyer that this is a good economic decision. Next. Okay, so another useful tool. I've got a colleague over at the University of Lausanne, which not too far, I guess, from Katia. She's Suzanne de Treville. She's an American, and she's developed what's called the Cost Differential Frontier Calculator. You'll find this online, and I've got a link to it on my last page. And what it looks at is how much less should a extended time delivery product have to be priced at to justify the risks that it creates of either stocking out and losing the order, or of having excess product which has to be disposed of at a huge discount or even thrown into the dump. And so you answer a series of questions that define the volatility of the product and the margin, et cetera, and then it comes up with a curve that tells you that kind of a relationship. So especially for something that's volatile like fashion, this is a useful tool. And generally speaking, the conclusions from this can be added to the conclusions from our calculator. So if you get 20% here and you get 20% there, then you got something like 40%. So you've got a pretty strong economic argument to use with the retailer, the manufacturer, whomever it is you're working with. Next. So just to show you that this is actually working, we were founded in 2010, and in 2010, let's say for all these years, we track a combination of reshoring, which is done by US-owned companies, like generally yourselves, and FDI, foreign direct investment, which is done by foreign companies. So think General Motors and Fiat or Siemens, something like that. So in 2010, the total of those two trends was 6,000 jobs, and by 2017 it reached 190,000. So up roughly 30 times over that time period. It then fell off in 2018, 2019, probably due to the trade wars and companies having business uncertainty and being unwilling to make commitments, but still being at substantially higher levels than significantly previously. Next. So we have a lot of problems, especially in our country. And I guess I'll mention that everything I'm showing you in terms of data is about the US, but the economic logic of producing domestically and supplying your market domestically wherever you live, the logic makes sense in every country. So the things we're talking about, whatever country you're in, you should assume you can use the same logic where you are. But some of the problems in the country that manufacturing will significantly mitigate, we've read so much about disadvantaged inner city populations, significantly driven by lack of jobs, lack of good jobs. I saw a piece on a 18-year-old inner city kid who had killed somebody, or he'd been in horrible crime problems. And someone asked him, what would it have taken to have kept you out of the gang? He said $12 an hour, a job, some kind of a payable job that would have kept me viable. We have the rural opioid epidemic, huge problem there in the rural areas. Again, significantly caused by offshoring and factories shutting down. In retail, I think there's going to be 4 million or more people unemployed. And to me, the best solution is to take those vacant strip malls and turn them into small factories and be producing things right near where people live. So something like someone mentioned, the bicycle going back and forth to work. As this happens, less need for spending because people will be taking care of themselves. There'll be more tax revenue, and the environment will be significantly enhanced. We did a study of a 2-pound aluminum die casting and compared making it in China, shipping it here versus here, and it's somewhere between 25 and 50% less environmental impact by making it here instead of making it there and shipping it. Next. So a couple of thoughts on apparel. Apparel is certainly the major consumption of textiles. And so we've written articles on it and had one in Industry Week, if anybody wants to look it up. I thought it was pretty good. But some of the suggestions that we've pulled out of various sources are that when you make a product in the US, apparel, textile and apparel, it's certainly good to talk about made in America, but even more than made in America is to show the facility, the history, to show your social consciousness in doing that you want to appeal beyond just the simple made in America label to show Winona and her farm, or the sheep, or you get that whole message across, and you've got a chance of engaging the consumer. And if you do that, you've got a chance to sell more and potentially charge a higher price, which might be necessary given your higher labor costs here in the US. Next slide. So some additional thoughts. When you're marketing it to market the environmental impact, it's clear that people, especially youth, respond. The benefit for local jobs and the quality, because it's assumed that the U.S. quality is better than from other countries. It's true in some cases, not necessarily in all, but all these things are the kinds of benefits that you want to use in marketing your product to help that perhaps higher priced product gain market advantage. Next. So what I've shown you is what companies can do, but there's a lot that the government can do. So for example, we've identified a series of actions here that will help the US price, instead of being 20%, 40% higher than the other countries, get it down to somewhere like this so that people can jump on board and say that's a good thing. So to us, skilled workforce is absolutely key. A value-added tax, I think, would be an impact. I think it would make sense to get the dollar down, maybe 20%. We're consistently too high because we're the reserve currency. Get healthcare costs down to a reasonable level because that gets compounded in labor costs. a series of things like this get everybody to use total cost. If we did that, each case in the price advantage column, I indicated how much price each one would pick up, totals 51%. And next slide. Okay, so in this slide, the first column shows how much we'd like to reduce our goods trade deficit. Trade deficit is $800 billion, about 5 million jobs worth. How many jobs that would represent, and then how much we'd have to reduce our price relative to offshore to convince the companies to get the price to a level where the consumer will actually buy the product. So we're continually promoting this we've tried with the Trump administration, we'll try with whoever's there to get them to take an objective analytical approach to what I'll call industrial policy, which is what it'll take to get the US to be competitive so that your concepts will succeed. Next.
Harry, there's about 1 minute left.
That's it, we're there.
Oh, perfect, okay.
Yeah. So good timing. So we co-sponsor with SEAMS. Some of you may know SEAMS, the association, very committed to manufacturing in the United States. And each year we have an award for sewn product reshoring award. And we do it in 3 categories: textiles, cut and sew, which is the contract manufacturers, and branded products. So, and we're flexible in that if you start up an apparel manufacturer, we assume it's reshoring because 97% of the apparel comes in from offshore. So we assume you must have taken it from foreign production. Okay, so we're flexible on that in that regard. Next slide. So this is ourselves holding back at the dike, holding back the flood of offshoring. And I'm the little guy when I had hair. And you've got my contact information, links, all kinds of things to reach us. My mission is to bring the jobs back. You're doing it. So anybody who's hearing and wants information, either pick it up on our website or email me. I'll be happy to help you. Thanks.
Thank you, Harry. And that wraps up our speaker lineup. I'm going to hand it over to Katya for the Q&A part of this webinar, but I just wanted to say that it's just such a strange time in the world. It seems like all the systems are falling apart, and actually they are. So, but that's really part of this, transition that we're all going through. So what really sustains me, and I think everybody attending this webinar, is the fact that there are so many opportunities to bring forth new systems. And so I think this lineup really pointed out a lot of the next phase that's coming, and it's very exciting. So I really sincerely thank all of you for your presentations. And Katya, I'll just hand it over to you now for the Q&A.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kirsten. Thank you, everybody, Winona, Rebecca, Harry. It was a very inspiring group of people. Clearly, you are all passionate about what you're doing, and I think it is this kind of spirit that we need to bring into discussions on sustainability and fashion. I just wanted to offer one very short reflection. When COVID lockdown was happening in Europe here, who were the least affected producers of fashion, like fashion companies? It was not those who have the longest supply chains, it was the local ones. It was the small companies, small local organizations who had their supply chain right there in front of them. So those were the least affected. And looking at your examples, these are clearly very inspiring avenues to pursue in order to keep fashion within the sustainability framework. We have a lot of questions, so I'm excited to share with you all of them. It won't be possible due to the time limit, of course. I'll start by asking one question to each of the speakers, and then we will see, because there's some really fantastic general questions. So let's start with the question for Winona. which is about the first green revolution. So the question goes as, the earlier green revolution industrialized agriculture, and that really destroyed the soil and biodiversity. We've seen the same happening as soon as we identify a renewable plant source like palm. How can we ensure that the planet wouldn't meet the same fate with hemp farming? So Winona, would you like to reflect on this question?
Yeah, yeah, thank you. I think it needs a new paradigm. You know, and I talk about the Green Revolution freely because Norman Borlaug, the architect, is from Minnesota. And, you know, it was a bad, you know, transition. And we know that 70% of the world's food is still produced by indigenous farmers, peasant farmers in our own villages. So we know that local food systems work. And what we want to do is relocalize and build these diverse, you know, secure food systems as well as secure systems of textile production. And I think that everyone here has spoken to that same. You know, I think it's going to require some conscious work. That's why I want tribes at the table, because I have been to a lot of meetings on hemp and it's a bunch of white guys who want to use Roundup and big equipment. And I was like, that was last time, not this time. You know, what we need, hemp has the potential to be organic. It has the potential, you know, if you work with the plant will give you hope and will give you life. If you just want to exploit it, you know, you're not going to do so well. That's pretty well evidenced in the CBD market in this country where everybody's trying to make $1 million on hemp. You ain't going to make $1 million, but you are going to make a revolution. And so I think it really requires, you know, the next economy being not about competition, but about cooperation and revitalizing, bringing back to life, renewing the renaissance of the hemp industry is an opportunity to transform an economic sector of this country. And I want to be there. We want to be there.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Winona. The next question is quite specific and it's for Rebecca, but it kind of demonstrates that people are interested in scalability of the practices that you are facilitating, that you are fostering. So the question is, I am interested in creating a natural bioregional silk economy in New England, where I live, with mulberry trees and using fiber shed principles of silk production. Who can I talk to? So in answering this question, Rebecca, I would ask you to also maybe reflect on how people in other regions of the world could implement some of your principles, in other regions of the US, but also in other regions of the world could implement the principles of fiber shed.
Sorry, I was muted. Well, first, the mission to bring in mulberry trees to feed silkworms is something that I primarily was exposed to spending time on the Mekong River area. So between Laos and the Thai border, as well as in parts of Vietnam, and northern Thailand, there's beautiful traditions of raising silk in the home, raising the worms in the home, doing all the hand spinning and the weaving, and those traditions exist. And at a small scale, silk makes a lot of sense. It's thousands of years old, and the traditions are beautiful. And at the village scale, it works remarkably well. Under commodification and scaling silk up, it raises a lot of questions around water usage, and it raises questions around in some cases, for folks who are vegan, if you don't eat the worm after you boil it, you are boiling all these worms alive. And are their bodies being used for food protein? In most cases, I don't think so at the industrial scale. So you have issues with silk when you start scaling it up in some cases. So the small scale vision of silk, I've seen it with such integrity and beauty, and how silk is so integral in the food part of people's lives, eating lower on the food chain and providing one of the most insulating, warm, lightweight fibers that humans have ever interacted with on this planet. So it's a beautiful vision. Mulberry fits very well in an agroforestry system, meaning you could alley crop wheat or other useful food crops between rows of mulberry. It could be beautiful for the North American continent to integrate home scale or village scale silk back in, because there were some examples of that in the North American continent. So anyway, I just think scale is an issue. Certain things don't work when you exploit them. Most things don't, is what Nona's saying. So how do we, I guess the question on how things show up in other parts of the world with FiberShed, there's 53 communities that we know of that are working on building out grassroots fiber systems. And they're using certain principles of soil to soil. They're looking at who are the entrepreneurs in this community who want to take this forward. They're lifting up the voices, the people who are already there, and helping them come into greater ability to function through maybe helping capitalize folks who are already on the ground. Again, it's not about coming from somewhere else and toppling what's there with what you think needs to happen. It's allowing what needs to emerge from the place to emerge, and meeting it where it is, and then helping it grow and improve, and not grow to become another monolith, but grow to become part of a system. So there's a lot of communities doing that work.
Great, thank you, Rebecca. I find it really interesting, your reflection of where do we draw a line between a local initiative and the good bring and become a more globalized system that has brought us where we are in terms of sustainability in fashion and in other areas. It is indeed a very fine line between scaling up and intention to do good and ending up where we are right now at the crossroads. We have a question for Harry. As I think it's a very interesting question that anchors the your presentation into local and smaller scale practices. So, as we consider reshoring and building new mills and factories, would love to hear the role of co-ops and other worker-owned models that would keep profits and resources in the community instead of in the hands of investors and shareholders. So, Harry, the mic is yours to reflect on this challenging question.
Yeah. I'm certainly not an expert on co-op. If there is a factory and it has capital equipment, if it has investment in capital equipment, working capital, et cetera, somebody's an investor. You know, whether it's a remote investor or a local investor, somebody's an investor, because someone has to put up that the initial capital to get started, and then to earn more capital from cash flow to reinvest and expand. So somewhere there's an investor, and therefore, to me, the question is, do you get better efficiency, quality, et cetera, with a co-op than you do with a remotely owned factory? And I have no data on that. I would hope that you would. You'd expect that people who have both control, have sort of an investment interest and a job interest would be more motivated and be more likely to make things happen correctly for themselves and for the community. But I have no data that would say whether that's really the case. There's a lot of information out on taking companies and then having them selling the owner selling it off to the employees, and overall the results are good, but there's some cases where it doesn't work any better than it did before the owner sold it.
Hey, thank you, Harry. It was great to give you a bit of extra time to reflect on some questions. And now I have there is a list of quite general questions to all the participants, and looking through them, there is one that kind of comes up, and I want to just remind you that the context for this webinar is really, we're coming from the perspective of lifestyles and a human-centered approach, right? So we have some questions that are fantastic, because there are questions asked by, the next one is asked by someone who really loves fashion, and I think it's really great to give some ideas that could help kind of make a connection between the production and the economy side of things, and how the consumers are experiencing all these new new opportunities, but also trying to find their way in the forest of, you know, easily available fast fashion options, for example. So here's the question to all of you. Let me just get up to. As someone who loves fashion and who is in the unemployment or low income right now, how do I help my community get involved, and how can I do this as an individual? So this person is asking to really to learn more about how do we connect to those community solutions as consumers. I let you, maybe someone wants to go first to answer this question. Generally, this connection between the production side and consumption side is very important, because in the end of the day, production is made for consumption, and it's really important to highlight how can we link the two together, how can we communicate better or get it more available, make it more available. Would someone like to go first?
I can jump in to say that the complexity of, there's many steps in between just production, consumption, and then maybe what we might call end of life. And Katya, you brought these things up with the clothing swap. If someone says they're has an experience of being low income, I'm also wondering if they have time, if there's an inverse relationship between the income they're bringing in and then the time they have. Sometimes those things are like, I'm time strapped and low income. That's very common in the United States. But if there's time, I would say that keeping your clothes in play is such an important part of that. And the idea, we set up at one of the local colleges a free mending bar. So we brought in drinks and appetizers and sewing machines and needles and threads, and we let people come together to teach each other about how they repair their clothes. And it was so pleasant because your hands are busy, so there's not a lot of that social discomfort that you're having to you're kind of immersed in a project, but you're casually getting to connect with people. It's a really beautiful socialization process for strangers to come together and mend their clothes. In COVID, that's maybe a little trickier, but maybe an outdoor mending bar. The other thing I've observed is the clothing swaps that were mentioned also in Katya's presentation. We have a learning center that we're developing, and we're turning one of the closets into a free natural fiber closet. So anytime a designer or a maker makes a prototype that doesn't quite fit them or the person they were intending just the right way, we put a garment that might cost $300 to $500 because it's an art garment. We put that in the closet, and we have anyone in the community can come and have access to these biodegradable, natural fiber, local clothes for free, because they're just part of the making, creative, iterative process that may not have gone just right. It's like kind of like imperfect vegetables, but imperfect.
The zero waste design.
Yeah, so I think there's ways, but again, keeping it in use is a cultural practice that can be available, and then sharing, building a sharing economy is such a great thing that we need to be doing to keep the footprint of our lives down.
Absolutely, yeah. Your opinion totally fits the opinion of researchers working on collaborative fashion consumption, so there's a lot of agreement there.
Excellent.
Harry, Winona, would you like to answer this question of bridging consumption and production perspectives here?
Where I live, I mean, there's several different kinds of clothing. There's traditional clothing, and we produce a lot of things. We sew a lot of our regalia, and we do a lot of things in artisan, so we have that's all passed down. That's a lot of that is intergenerational heritage. So we have a pretty strong core of that. And although hemp is a fiber that came from Asia, we have a long history of weaving here. With our own fibers, particularly what's known as dog bane or Indian hemp, and we sent our first hemp fiber off to the Navajo weavers. to have them look at it, to make some artisan pieces with it, mixing it with the churro sheep and then doing individually. But, kind of in that broader question, yeah, I mean, we spend a lot of time upscaling at our work, taking older garments, repairing them, making them more beautiful, putting some artisan patches, beadwork on it, and then also just kind of like moving stuff around. Even in our area, there's a lot of older people, like Finnish people, and they take all that microfiber stuff and cut it into strips and make rugs out of it. So a lot of our rural economy has historically been, because town is a 4-letter word. We are far from town, and so we do a lot of things locally.
That's a very interesting point that you raised, that there's this big gap between the rural reality and the urban reality. And as we know, with urbanization, that's where most people are moving. That most of the economy is centered in those urban clusters, urban. How do we really connect what is the solutions proposed by, we know now, by Rebecca? These are mostly happening in the farms. These are mostly happening out of sight of those people who just go to the main street and see the shops on each side, which are very conveniently located and work, I don't know, 24/7 almost. So it's another thing that I find very important to address in debating sustainability of fashion and bringing in local solutions. But I wanted to give a word maybe to Harry. Would you like to respond to this nexus between consumption and production?
Yeah, so 2 things. First, a couple of my slides did deal with this, talking about what aspects of your local production make sense to connect to the consumer. So first, I'd remind everybody of that. And then second, it's not exactly the same thing, but to overcome the price problem, I have seen companies go from a business to consumer model to instead cut out the retailer and go to business to consumer. So I have a good friend who owns Liberty Tabletop, which is the only US maker of stainless steel flatware in the United States. And he couldn't compete with the imports from China, Mexico, et cetera, just couldn't selling through retail. But when he sells directly, he's very price competitive because he's cut out that huge margin it's in the middleman, middle person, and then and he's booming, especially after COVID. So many people want to buy American that his sales doubled, tripled, something like that from last year. So especially if you're starting small, developing an image, developing a consumer base, an email list, communicating with people, selling direct to the consumer is probably the right way to go.
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, absolutely. I really like the slides that you have proposed to discuss these different communication to consumers. And this is a question I will take advantage of my position as a moderator and maybe ask a question to all of you. In the United States, you clearly are all working towards the same goal. Do you see a potential for joining forces under, or maybe it already exists, in a sort of a network that would help share the learning lessons with each other, that would support each other, or something along the lines as what Rebecca and Nona have been talking about? And do you think it would make sense to maybe extend this network and open up those lessons to people from outside the US? We have just a few minutes to talk about it, so if anyone wants to jump in, go ahead.
Well, there are groups that are trying to do that. So I'm a member of something called Coalition for a Prosperous America, and they work very hard to enable, or let's say promote and advocate for Made in USA. There's Alliance for American Manufacturing. There's, I think, Make It in America, last name Mendoza. So there's groups that are pushing pretty hard in this direction already. So I would suggest trying to gather with those groups instead of starting another group and fracturing the effort even further.
You know, from my perspective, the industry that I want to see reborn doesn't exist in this country. And so we actually need help from overseas. We need the European, the Belgians got the best linen, the Czech Republic, the Romanians, the people who are doing hemp and hung in there because it didn't get criminalized, the Turkish people. You know, we need to learn from those artisan and, you know, I think of appropriate technology and appropriate scale with these quality of life, you know, issues in all kinds of manufacturing. And we would, you know, we really need to share and learn from them. You know, because if you're going to change the world, you're not going to do it with one boutique mill. You got to have a bunch of mills. You got to change the whole industry. And that's the potential that, you know, we're talking about here with textiles, you know, from the beginning to the, you know, back the cycle that Rebecca is talking about. But we need to, you know, build a stronger working group of sharing that information with us, because I've been checking out everything and everybody wants to give us a lot of advice, but they're from the US and the industry doesn't exist here. So how do you build a sustainable organic hemp industry? You know, that's the question. And I think the answer is in Europe, you know, and is in Asia. It's not here, but we're going to build it here.
Through a lot of trial and error. Rebecca?
I think if this were something that could be organized at the United Nations level, in response to, I know there's a UNFCCC, there's a fashion charter that's working on, I think it's 30 or 45% reductions in CO2e by 2030. It would be really helpful because that's a very brand-led group. We've contributed our soil carbon data, for instance, to that group, but yes, it's led by colleagues, but they all are invested in the larger corporations. So what would be helpful to me and to the communities we work with and so many hundreds of people on the ground is if the UN were to support a portal for grassroots textile organizing. And I think sharing our stories, the silk production in the Mekong, you know, that should be on we should be able to understand where the places are for open source. You know, there's a big push to privatize genetics in the textile system right now. They're going to privatize so many aspects of core small base living organisms as a silver bullet. And I'm very concerned that the grassroots communities are not getting a voice in the future of textiles, and to put Winona's community at the table with the Romanians and the Belgians to make sure we have a portal and we have a resource list of all the places where good open source technologies are working for people.
That's a really very relevant suggestion. And with that, actually, I think I will hand it over to Garrett, who can answer both Rebecca's suggestion and maybe offer a couple of thoughts to close the webinar. So Garrett, please.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rebecca. That was such a great intro to being able to offer the resources that are there, because I think a lot of the presentations here highlighted the importance of needing to have not only technology but experience exchange. And I know that you referenced the UNFCCC effort that they're doing, but there are many UN bodies that are engaged in textiles and the fiber chain. And in the final follow-up, when we do a summary of tonight's webinar, we'll be happy to put resources into that and highlight how people can get more engaged with those. Because I think it's also, as you mentioned, it's not just one mill, it's many mills. So we need to be able, it's not just the hub of the UN, but it's of local languages, local regional issues, but we're happy to outline what we have. But what was really interesting in looking at the themes that came out of this discussion is when you look at COVID and you look at people talk about the post-COVID context or the COVID context, we hear a lot about building back better. And the conversation we've had tonight about sustainable living around fiber textiles has highlighted some of the exact same themes that are coming out at the global level. So I really want to thank Winona for referencing the need for a new paradigm shift, because moving from competition to collaboration. And I really liked the references to the sharing economy. All of these themes are what are happening in the global dialogue around this, but this shows when you get drilled down to the issue of how we live, that these are the key points that are there. We've also talked about systems and systemic change. And one of the things about living is that the systems that we have on how we make our decisions around textiles or food or mobility aren't actually all that well known. And when we begin to look at them, we realize that they need to be better woven together, they need to be organic, and they need to work for the local community and reinforce that and meet basic needs. So I think systems was another key element. Highlight again the fact that this reference around technology and information exchange is critical, because the will is there, even if the capital is there. If you don't know how to do it, the twinning with those who do can make a huge difference in that. I think the final point would be also the issue around scale, is that where you have things happening, how you move that to scale is the next challenge that's there. And as a final comment, I'd like to note, Rebecca, in your presentation at the end, there were a number of pictures of people who were wearing some of the products I'm assuming that the work you had done was showing. We also need to recognize that outside the people who are attending this kind of a webinar or who are involved in sustainability, they need the visuals, the narrative, the motivation, the passion to make choices that are more sustainable, because just doing it because it's right may not be what's going to motivate them to do that, because there are a lot of different what's right that people need to follow up on a daily life. So with that, just to note, it's been a true pleasure. Kirsten, do you have any final words you'd like to offer?
No, I'd just like to thank everybody again for all the audience for joining and sticking around, for all the great panel discussions and presentations. I really do hope that we can move forward and continue to work together, and sort of in that vision of a portal or a way where all these different groups can support each other, you know, because it's a global world, but we all need to create these new locally expressed economies. So I think we all have to help each other going forward. And I really look forward to working with everyone here, and invite all the attendees, you know, to, you know, join the journey too. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. And we'll be sharing with you all the results of tonight in the next week or so. So thank you, everybody. Have a nice evening.
Rich.
Bye-bye. This was great.
Cheers.
Bye,
Bye.
ladies.
Nice rest of the day. Bye.